This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of Roots and All. Today's episode is a bit different because I'm not well at the moment and the podcast has taken a backseat to hospital visits and sleeping lots, I'm afraid. But out of something negative comes a positive because I decided to remaster and re-release an episode from the back catalogue. And this week we're dipping back into 97 with Doug Tallamy. But we're not just hitting replay, we're bringing new light to it, inspired by last week's conversation with the incredible Kelly Morse. Kelly shared the story behind the name of her business, how it was sparked by a single powerful line from one of Doug Tallamy's books. And that moment really struck a chord because it was a reminder of how a few words can ripple outwards and inspire action, creativity, even entire careers. So it felt like the perfect time to bring this one back, give it a polish and let it breathe again. So whether this is your first time hearing it or you've been with us since the early days, I think you'll find something new in this version. The first question that I wanted to ask you, and I don't want to dwell on this because it is something that I've spoken to previous guests about. And again, I think you've addressed it quite extensively in many of your books. But is it incorrect to think that nature is somewhere else and that it's outside our garden fences? And if so, why is that?
Well, that's the condition we have created. So if we consider ourselves to be separate from nature and we confine nature to little parks and preserves, there are two reasons that's not going to work. First of all, we need functional ecosystems everywhere to produce the ecosystem services that support humans, not just in a few little parks and preserves. Nature is not just for our entertainment, someplace we go visit. We need it everywhere. So confining it outside of the places where humans live and work and play that's ultimately a huge mistake. And it has led to what we see in the news. Insect apocalypse is here. In North America, we've lost 3 billion birds. The UN says we're going to lose 1 million species. None of those things are options in the long run. Yet that's where we are because of the way we landscape, because we create dead zones where humans live and expect nature to be happy someplace else. So that's in the long run, that's not going to work. And what we need to do is find ways for humans and nature to coexist.
I thought it was interesting, the concept of carrying capacity that you talk about in your book. Can you give an overview of what that is and why it's important to humans?
Well, every ecosystem, every place, the planet as a whole, has the ability to support a certain amount of life. So the definition of carrying capacity is the ability of a particular place to support a population of any particular species in a sustainable way. So the population can reach the carrying capacity and stay there or oscillate around it as long as it doesn't exceed the carrying capacity and degrade the resources that support it. Any population that exceeds its carrying capacity, where there are too many individuals for that environment to support, is going to ultimately degrade the carrying capacity, and then there'll be fewer individuals that place can support. The big part of that carrying capacity that even ecological texts tend to ignore is that when one species exceeds the carrying capacity, it degrades local resources, but it degrades it not just for that species, but for every other species that needs those resources. So the biggest species that has exceeded its carrying capacity right now is humans, which means we have taken resources from everything else. And this is why we're in the 6th great extinction. Everything is going towards supporting burgeoning human populations unsustainably because there are now more humans on the planet than the planet can sustain at the lifestyle that we all want. And everything else is suffering because of it. Rather than trying to figure out how many humans we can cram onto the planet before everything collapses totally, we should be trying to figure out how many humans we can sustain on this planet without anything collapsing, because that's the only thing that truly is sustainable in the future.
I like your book, Nature's Best Hope, because you actually give practical advice in it. But one of the things that struck me when I was reading it is you talk about hooded warblers and the fact that they won't set up a breeding territory unless there are other breeding pairs in the area, even if all the other conditions seem perfect. And to me, that seems to illustrate how little we know about the nuances of the life cycles of other species, and that we can't assume that we know what they want or need. So is this going to be problematic if we do want to implement guidelines or ecological best practice moving forward?
Well, lack of knowledge of the species we're trying to conserve is certainly an impediment. And the hooded warbler is a great example. When you really get to know the species, you find out they need more than just space and resources. They need a social context too. And apparently this is true for martins and probably a number of birds. And it's probably true for a number of mammals as well. Probably less true for invertebrates. They're simply less social to begin with. But our knowledge of the natural world is really pretty scanty, and yet here we are trying to manipulate it and either for good or for bad. And we have a lot to learn. So the more we learn, the better. This is a growing problem because most of us now are more separated from nature than ever. Our ecological IQ on a scale of 1 to 10 is about a 1. Yet we're pretending we're going to go out and make things better. So we need to study, we need to educate well beyond the basics of where we are.
And do you feel like citizen scientists and gardeners have a role to play in that?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So one of the other things that struck me, and it is a question that I've had when I've been reading sort of books that are carrying a similar message to yours, is that if we lose species that have evolved as specialist feeders, won't that ecological niche be filled by a similar amount of individuals overall, but just from a reduced number of species? So they are the generalists. And is that a problem? Because isn't it survival of the fittest after all?
Okay, two things there. First of all, that's a great hypothesis, that if you lose your specialist, the generalists will fill in. Most of the specialists we're talking about here are insects that have specialized relationships with plants. And the reason they're so important is that they are supplying the energy, the food that drives our food webs. So losing these insects is not an option. It's not just that I like to talk about insects. They're critical in the support of the rest of the species in an ecosystem. So if you trade specialists for generalists, everything should be okay because there's just as many insects. That's the hypothesis. Well, we actually looked at that. We've looked at that in a couple of different experiments. And it turns out that our generalists aren't nearly as generalized as we think they are. And they do not compensate. And none of our experiments have shown that they compensate for the loss of specialists. The loss of generalists is less than the loss of specialists, but it's not nearly enough to compensate in terms of diversity or abundance or the amount of biomass that's available for other animals to eat. We're looking now at the definitions of specialists and generalists. Some people think that it's a continuum, and at one end of the continuum, you got generalists that can eat anything, and at the other end, you got specialists that can only eat one thing. That's actually not the way it is. 90% of the insects are highly specialized, where they can only eat 1 or 2 plant lineages. Rather than looking at the number of plant lineages that an insect can eat, let's look at the number of plant lineages that they cannot eat. And when you do that, even our very most special generalist insects, and if in this country, that would be things like the white-marked tussock moth or the Io moth or one of the borers, they can eat over 100 genera of plants. And that sounds very, very specialized. But when you look at the number of plants that are available to them, there's about 96% of the plants out there that they cannot eat. So even the most generalized insects are highly specialized. When you look at the array of plants that they could eat because they're available to them, but they don't. So that's the problem by thinking that generalists are going to compensate. There's no study that shows that they actually do, and that's why we can't rely on them. Mm-hmm. And you talked about adaptation. Mm. Survival of the fittest. Well, yes, and in the long run, that is going to work its way out. But humans are changing everything about our environment so rapidly. Those changes are exceeding the ability of adaptation to keep up. So, for example, in Europe, you have the common reed, Phragmites australis, and we brought the European genotype over to this country almost 400 years ago. It was packing material in the earliest ships. And it has been here as an invasive species for almost 400 years. Well, in Europe, it supports 170 species of insects. So it's a good native, it's a functional part of the ecosystem. After 400 years of being in this country, it only supports 5. So adaptation's happening, but far slower than the rate of change that we humans are delivering to the environment. In the meantime, Phragmites australis has taken over the marshes, made them monocultures. There used to be diverse ecosystems with lots of plants. Now it's a monoculture of one plant that can only support 5 insects. And that's why, so in 10,000, 100,000 years, will things work themselves out? Probably. But, and that's what evolution does. That's what adaptation does over time. But, those are evolutionary timescales, not ecological timescales. And we are ruining things on ecological timescales and expecting evolution to keep up. It can't do it. So again, that's why we have the 6th great extinction. We're just changing things way too fast for anything to adapt to.
Mm-hmm. And talking about host species, I know that you did spend an entire book putting forward the case for native plants, and it isn't possible to sum up that case here. But if you could choose maybe 1 or 2 of the most compelling reasons to illustrate the case for natives over invasive plants or non-native plants in gardens, what would they be?
Well, I do have to develop that here because that is the main reason. The fact that the kingpins of our food webs, the insect herbivores, are by and large unable to eat those plants. They are unable to develop and reproduce on those plants. And that's because plants protect themselves from insects primarily with phytochemistry. They load their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals. Those are secondary metabolic compounds that make the leaves inedible, except for the insects that have evolved adaptations to get around those defenses. So that's what a close coevolutionary relationship with a plant brings to an insect over evolutionary time. And you're talking about many, many generations. So, for example, the monarch butterfly is a specialist on milkweeds. Well, the monarch lineage around the world has been associated with milkweeds for millions of years. This is not a sudden adaptation. And that is true for most of the specialized relationships that are out there. And again, 90% of our insect herbivores are host plant specialists. So when we bring plants from China or South America or wherever to our gardens, only a very few insects are able to use them. And that's typically because they already have the adaptations necessary because the plants they evolved with are sharing common chemicals to these new plants that we brought in. So what we do, we create a very depauperate insect community associated with these gardens. Now, this is confusing to a lot of people because most people only see the insects that are going to flowers. And they say, oh, there's plenty of insects on my flowers. Well, most of those are generalist pollinators. They're not eating the leaves, so they're not exposed to the defensive phytochemistry I'm talking about. But most pollinators are not important parts of the food web. It's caterpillars that are driving the food web. They're transferring more energy from plants to any other to up the food web to higher trophic levels than any other type of animal. If you remove caterpillars from an ecosystem, you have serious declines in those other animals, particularly birds. In North America, 96% of our birds are rearing their young on insects, and we have found most of those insects are caterpillars. We've looked at the what dominates nestling diets in 20 families of birds in North America, and 16 of the 20 families is dominated by caterpillars. So when we design gardens and landscapes that don't make caterpillars, and that's easy to do, you lose all those birds. One important thing we need to focus on is how different plants are, even native plants, in their ability to make caterpillars. So, for example, I'm sure this is true in Europe, but it's certainly true here in North America. James Quercus oaks are number one in their ability to make caterpillars. I live in the mid-Atlantic states of North America, and just in our few states, there are 557 species of caterpillars that develop on oaks. Compared to other native plants like tulip trees, it's a good native. There's only 21 that can develop on tulip trees. And then you look at these non-native species, whether they're invasive or not, things like ginkgo or crepe myrtle or many of our favorite ornamentals, most of them support zero, no caterpillars at all. So there's a fantastic variation in the ability to produce the animals that drive our food web with plant choice. And that's why plant choice in our gardens is so important.
Well, talking of caterpillars, in the UK, some landscape architects and designers, and particularly those that are involved in public planting, would argue that our native trees are disease prone and therefore non-natives provide us with more versatile and healthier alternatives. Do you face that argument in the US?
Absolutely. But remember, landscape designers, landscape architects, most gardeners in general are gardening for aesthetics. They want plants that nothing can touch. They call them pest-free. So you have a beautiful landscape that nothing can use, which is a dead zone. And that is the crux of the problem. We're loading our landscapes with plants that do not pass the energy they harness from the sun to anything else. And when you do that in a few places, it's okay. But when you do it everywhere, it's not okay, because that is the collapse of the food webs that support our birds. When you look at it in the UK, the house sparrow is in serious decline. When you lose the house sparrow, then there's a real issue. So designing landscapes that actually support other life forms is a critical part of our future. There's just too many of us everywhere to design these dead zones, even though they're beautiful.
Yeah, and your book details a system whereby we can make relatively easy changes to bring maximum benefits to wildlife. And it's based on research that's been conducted in the US. And I do have quite a number of US listeners to the podcast. But are you aware of any other similar types of research that are being carried out in other countries?
There's a fair amount in Australia. A guy last name Samways has done a fair amount of it. There have been a number of reviews recently, within the last decade, of what the impact of non-native plants has been in Europe, in Australia, in North America, not so much in South America. And every one of these reviews, reviewing dozens and dozens of studies, concludes that there's a serious depression of insect populations when native plants are replaced by non-native plants. It's not always the case. There are a few exceptions, but the average response is a serious decline in insects. So it's a phenomenon that has been studied around the world. And of course, the theoretical advances way back in the 70s and 80s that pointed out how important insect-plant interactions were, how the specialized relationships between insects and plants, coevolution and all of that. They predicted this, decades ago. So theoretically, none of this is new. None of it's surprising. But what they didn't know back then was the extent to which non-native plants were replacing native plants and what that might do to ecosystem function and the biodiversity crisis. That's the part that we're focusing on now. But as you said earlier, the good news is it's relatively easy to turn this around. Unless you've actually lost a species to extinction, if you put what it needs back in the landscape, insects are really good at recolonizing the plants they need. I've demonstrated that here at home a number of times by putting in a plant. I don't even know where the original insect population comes from. But within sometimes months, but often a few years, they find these plants, and I've got a healthy population. So if we put the host plants that support our insect diversity and abundance back into our landscapes, we can rebuild viable food webs, which will recharge the ability of birds to breed and many other parts of the food web.
Mm-hmm. And do you think if we could wave a wand tomorrow and plant native plants that would benefit invertebrates, which would then benefit birds, would that solve the problem, or do we need to concentrate on other things, kind of habitat loss in other ways? Are there other problems that we're facing too?
Well, this gets back to carrying capacity, and it gets back to the human footprint. Every time we build a building, that space is no longer useful for habitat on any level. And we keep expanding our urban footprint, our suburban footprint, the number of, the infrastructure, all the paved roads. We're paving over the planet. We're cutting down the tropical rainforest. I just read today that the loss of tropical rainforest has accelerated again. So putting native plants back where we humans are will help all of that, but it's not going to replace the importance of these natural areas that we keep paving over. So it's a piece of the conservation puzzle. It's not the entire puzzle.
I wondered when I was reading your new book whether your message had developed or changed since your previous books.
The urgency has increased. When I wrote Bringing Nature Home, we had not done a lot of the research trying to put numbers behind the predictions at that point. But in the last 15 years, we have done a lot of that, and other people have done it too. So I now have data to support much of what I said in Bringing Nature Home. And again, the global headlines are creating an urgency that propels the message. The general public now is hearing it not just from me anymore. That's good. They're hearing it from major headlines of all the major media outlets. And they're concerned about it. This has surprised me. When the headline about the global insect declines hit, I didn't think anybody would care about that. But I immediately got emails from people from all over the country saying, "Oh, is this true? What can we do? What can we do?" So that's good news. People want to do something. And there's some things they can do that are very easy, have nothing to do with plants. How about light pollution at night? Turn your lights out at night. Or put a motion sensor on your lights so it only turns on when the bad man comes. Or if you don't want to do that, put a yellow bulb in your night lights because that's less attractive to insects. Or a yellow LED bulb is particularly unattractive. But we lose billions of insects all over the country, all over the world, every night because we've got lights on. And most of the time, we don't even know why we have those lights on. It's just a habit. So there are things that the average homeowner can do almost everywhere that will help insect declines.
Yeah, turning lights off is a great one. Is there anything else that people can do in order to keep us moving in the right direction? And I'm thinking also specifically about, is there any kind of key research that needs to be done, in your opinion, to move us forward?
We already know much of what we need to know. One of the biggest step forwards, I think, that we've come up with recently is the recognition of how different native plants are among native plants. But what I'm calling keystone plants, where about 5% of the native plants are producing about 75% of the food. That's a really important piece of information because that means they have to be the backbone of any landscape, those keystone plants. And then you can diversify with other plants. So learning that has been a big step forward. Another thing is that there is room for compromise here. But one of my students finished some research recently showing that if you have 70% of the plant biomass in your landscape native, 30% can be non-native, and you still can have viable food webs. Particularly if the 70% of those keystone plants. So that's great because it shows there's room for compromise. If my message truly was you can have no non-native plants, I'd have very few listeners. People would say, I don't care if the rest of the biodiversity collapses. I want my pretty plant. You can still have your pretty plants as long as they're not dominating the landscape. So to me, that's good news. But how these keystone plants interact with light pollution is an important piece of research that needs to be ironed out. We've got preliminary evidence now that you can use keystone plants. You can have your oak trees. They bring in lots of moths to make those caterpillars, but then they all get killed at lights. So you're having part of the solution, but not all the solution. And another key thing we need to understand is how much plant material do you need to have a viable food web? Is one flower in a pot going to do it, or it's obvious that the more the better? But what is the minimum amount when you can actually have a self-replicating food web? And nobody's looked at that on any level. So always room for new research, but we are way past the point where we need to wait for new research. New research will guide us, but we need to start acting right away. And one of the first things that, at least in this country, that the typical homeowner can do is reduce the area that's in lawn. The turf grass doesn't do any of the things we need to do on our landscapes. I always talk about 4 major things every landscape has to do. One is support that viable food web we've been talking about. Another is it's sequester carbon. It's plants that are pulling carbon out of the air and putting it in their tissues and then pumping it into the ground. It is the easiest way for the individual to address climate change issues is by just putting more plants into their landscape. Another one is managing watershed. Everybody lives in a watershed, and it's plants that manage that watershed. And again, all the times we take plants out of our landscapes and replace them either with pavement or lawn, will wrecken the watershed. And then the final thing every landscape has to do is support a viable pollinator community. And it's not for agriculture. You hear all the time, they pollinate a third of our crops, so we need pollinators. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants, and that is not an option. And we need those pollinators everywhere, not just in parks and preserves, but everywhere, including our yards, including our cities, everywhere where we want plants, which is everywhere. So how do we accomplish those 4 goals on your average landscape? That's more research that needs to be done.
I must just ask you one last question, which I may slot in earlier. One of the arguments that I find people using to counter using native plants in this country, in the UK, is that they say we don't have the variety of species that you have in the US. So they say our native flora isn't as pretty as yours. What would you say to that? Is there an argument against that?
Well, it's true. You're an island.
I thought it was just subjective.
You don't have as many species. But again, you said the key word there. So our landscapes aren't as pretty. And if your only goal is to design for aesthetics, then you're right. You bring in plants from all over the world. But there's a huge downside to that. We need to design beautiful landscapes that are functional. So take advantage of those that 30% of non-natives we can use ornamentally as accents. But you have to start. It's like building a building without the supports. You can't build a building out of wallpaper. You have to have those 2x4s, and you got to have the supports up, and then you can decorate it. And that's what we've been missing. We've been missing those keystone native plants to support the life around us. I mean, you've got the wonderful English Quercus robur, the English oak over there. You need to get as many of those back into the landscape as possible. Most environmental issues are huge, and the individual feels helpless. Climate change. What can I do as an individual? And I understand that. There's nothing you can do where you see a change tomorrow, but not this issue. You can put those plants in your yard and see that change tomorrow. You can see things come and start to use those plants. You can see life return to your little piece of the earth almost immediately. That's positive feedback. You as an individual, whether you own land or whether you're going to volunteer on a park or a preserve, are part of the conservation puzzle of the future. You're one piece of it, But that puzzle won't be complete if you leave that piece out. So it's a very important piece, and you can do your part. Don't think of the Earth's problems. You're not trying to address the Earth's problems yourself. Just worry about the little piece of the Earth that you own or can influence. If you get rid of the invasive species, cut the lawn in half, put in pollinator plants, and use those keystone plants, you've done everything you can do, and you can feel good about it.
Thank you once more to Doug for his words and his wisdom. And thanks to you for listening and bearing with me at this time. We should be back to normal next week. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.